Why you overanalyze interactions. You replay a conversation in your head for the 5th time, scanning for mistakes no one else seemed to notice. A pause that felt too long, a word that might have sounded wrong, a laugh that may have been awkward. Meanwhile, the other person has already moved on, but your mind hasn't. The brain is built to scan for social risk. The human brain did not evolve for modern conversations, text messages, or brief social exchanges that can be replayed endlessly in private. It evolved in environments where belonging to a group directly influenced survival. For most of human history, being accepted by others meant access to protection, food, and cooperation. Being rejected or excluded could mean isolation in a dangerous world. Because of this, the brain developed a highly sensitive system for detecting social risk. At the center of this system is a constant, often unconscious monitoring process. The brain tracks facial expressions, tone of voice, pauses, shifts in attention, and subtle changes in behavior. These cues were once essential signals that helped early humans determine whether they were safe within a group or at risk of exclusion. A slight change in someone's expression might have indicated disagreement or anger. A pause in response could have signaled hesitation, distrust, or social distance. Over time, the ability to notice these signals became deeply embedded in human cognition. In modern life, this same system is still active, but the environment has changed dramatically. Most social interactions today do not carry serious consequences. A slightly awkward conversation, a delayed reply, or a neutral tone is rarely meaningful in any real sense. However, the brain does not automatically adjust its sensitivity to context. Instead, it often continues to treat social ambiguity as if it were a potential threat. This is why minor interactions can feel disproportionately significant, and why they are frequently replayed in the mind afterward. The brain's social monitoring system is closely linked to emotional processing regions that assign importance to experiences. When something feels socially uncertain, the brain flags it as worthy of attention. This can lead to heightened awareness during the interaction itself and intensified reflection afterward. The goal of this system is not to create anxiety, but to prevent mistakes that could lead to rejection. In ancestral environments, this was adaptive. Today, it can result in overanalysis of harmless moments. Another important factor is that the brain prioritizes potential threats over neutral or positive outcomes. From a survival standpoint, it is more important to notice signs of rejection than signs of acceptance. Missing a threat could have had serious consequences in the past, while missing a positive cue was less dangerous. This imbalance creates a natural tendency to focus on what might have gone wrong in a conversation rather than what went smoothly. As a result, the mind often replays interactions searching for subtle errors or signs of disapproval, even when none exist. This scanning process is largely automatic. People are not consciously deciding to overanalyze every interaction. Rather, their brains are continuing a pattern of evaluation that runs in the background. After a social exchange ends, the mind may attempt to review what happened, almost like a system running diagnostics. It replays sentences, tone shifts, and facial expressions, trying to interpret their meaning. The intention is problem-solving, but the outcome is often unnecessary doubt. Importantly, this system is also sensitive to self-perception. When someone is unsure of how they are being perceived, the brain increases its monitoring activity. This creates a feedback loop. Uncertainty leads to more scanning, which leads to more perceived uncertainty. Over time, this loop can strengthen the habit of overthinking even ordinary interactions. Understanding that the brain is built to scan for social risk helps explain why overanalysis happens so easily. It is not a flaw in reasoning or a lack of awareness. It is an outdated survival mechanism, operating in a world where the stakes are usually low. The challenge is not to eliminate this system, but to recognize when it is overreacting to situations that are not actually dangerous. Uncertainty feels like a problem to solve. The human mind has a strong preference for closure. When something is incomplete, unclear, or open-ended, it creates a subtle form of tension. This tension is not always dramatic, but it is persistent enough that the brain treats it as something that needs resolution. In social situations, this tendency becomes especially noticeable. A short reply, a slightly awkward pause, or an unclear expression can leave behind a feeling that something isn't finished. The mind then tries to complete the picture, even when there is no missing information to find. At its core, the brain is a prediction machine. It constantly builds models of what is happening around us and what is likely to happen next. When information is clear, the model is stable, but when something is uncertain, like whether someone was annoyed, bored, or simply distracted, the model becomes unstable. The brain dislikes this instability because it makes outcomes harder to anticipate. To restore balance, it begins generating explanations. These explanations are not necessarily accurate. They are simply attempts to remove ambiguity. In social interactions, uncertainty is everywhere. People rarely say exactly what they think. Tone can be interpreted in multiple ways, and context is often incomplete. A message without punctuation might feel neutral or cold depending on interpretation. A delayed response could mean anything from busyness to disinterest. The brain, however, does not like leaving these possibilities unresolved. It begins cycling through them, evaluating each one as if the correct answer must exist and be discovered. This process feels like problem solving, even when there is no actual problem to solve. The mind takes a gap in information and treats it like a puzzle. It asks, what did that really mean? Was that awkward moment significant? Did I say something wrong? Each question feels productive because it gives the illusion of progress. But in reality, it often leads to more uncertainty rather than less. The more the mind analyzes, the more interpretations it generates, and the harder it becomes to settle on any single explanation. A key reason this happens is that uncertainty carries emotional weight. The brain associates unclear social outcomes with potential risk. If someone's reaction is ambiguous, the mind may interpret that ambiguity as a possible warning sign. Even if there is no real danger, the feeling of not knowing can be uncomfortable, enough to trigger deeper analysis. In this way, uncertainty is treated not just as missing information, but as a problem that might affect social standing or acceptance. Another important factor is that humans are not naturally tolerant of open loops. When a situation is left unresolved, it tends to stay active in memory. This is why unfinished tasks or unanswered questions can linger in the mind long after the moment has passed. Social interactions are particularly powerful in this regard because they involve other people, and other people introduce unpredictability. The mind tries to simulate their thoughts and reactions in order to complete the loop, but since it cannot actually access those thoughts, it relies on guessing. This guessing process often leans negative because the brain is biased toward avoiding social mistakes. It tends to generate cautious or self-critical interpretations first. If there are multiple possible explanations for someone's behavior, the mind may prioritize the ones that suggest disapproval or error. This does not happen because those interpretations are correct, but because they feel more urgent from a risk prevention standpoint. Over time, treating uncertainty as a problem to solve can become habitual. The mind begins to automatically engage in analysis after any unclear interaction, even when the situation is trivial. This creates a cycle where uncertainty triggers thinking, thinking generates more uncertainty, and the loop continues until attention shifts elsewhere. The original interaction itself often contains very little meaningful information, but the mental process surrounding it makes it feel significant. Recognizing this pattern helps clarify what is actually happening. The discomfort after a social interaction is not always evidence that something went wrong. More often, it is simply the mind reacting to incomplete information. It is trying to close a gap that does not need to be closed, using a process that feels logical but is driven by discomfort rather than accuracy. Negative bias amplifies small moments. The human brain does not record experiences like a neutral camera. It evaluates them, tags them with emotional meaning, and stores them in a way that prioritizes survival and learning. One of the most powerful features of this system is negative bias, the tendency to give more weight to negative experiences than neutral or positive ones. While this bias once served an important survival function, in modern social life it can distort how everyday interactions are remembered and interpreted. From an evolutionary perspective, negative bias made sense. Early humans who paid closer attention to danger, rejection, or failure were more likely to avoid threats and survive. Missing a positive opportunity might have been unfortunate, but missing a negative signal, such as hostility from others or signs of exclusion from a group, could have had serious consequences. As a result, the brain became tuned to prioritize negative information, storing it more strongly and recalling it more easily than positive information. This system is still active today, even though most social interactions no longer carry high stakes. In everyday conversations, small moments that are slightly awkward, uncertain, or emotionally unclear can become disproportionately important in memory. A brief pause before someone responds, a neutral facial expression, or a slightly awkward sentence can stand out far more than an entire conversation that went smoothly. The brain treats these moments as signals worth examining, even if they are objectively minor. What makes negative bias especially powerful is how it interacts with attention. During a social interaction, people are often focused on how they are being perceived. This self-focused attention increases sensitivity to potential mistakes or signs of disapproval. If something slightly negative happens, a misworded sentence, a moment of silence, a lack of immediate reaction, the brain flags it as significant. Later, when recalling the interaction, that moment is often the first thing that comes to mind, even if it was surrounded by neutral or positive cues. Memory itself is also not evenly distributed. The brain does not store every detail of an interaction with equal clarity. Instead, it compresses experiences into key highlights, and negative moments tend to be overrepresented in this compression. This is partly because emotionally charged events are encoded more strongly. A small awkward moment can feel more emotionally intense than the rest of the interaction, even if nothing objectively important happened. Over time, this creates a skewed version of the event in memory, where the negative detail feels central. Another important factor is interpretation. The brain does not simply recall events, it also assigns meaning to them. When negative bias is active, ambiguous moments are more likely to be interpreted in a negative way. For example, a short reply might be remembered not as the other person was busy, but as they were uninterested. A neutral expression might be interpreted as disapproval. These interpretations are often made automatically, without conscious awareness, and they shape how the entire interaction is understood afterward. This amplification effect can also create a feedback loop. When a small negative moment is given extra weight, it can change how future interactions are approached. Someone might become more self-conscious, more cautious, or more analytical in similar situations. This increased self-monitoring can make future interactions feel more tense, which in turn increases the likelihood of noticing additional small negatives. Over time, the brain becomes even more sensitive to minor imperfections, reinforcing the cycle. Importantly, negative bias does not mean that people are irrational or overly sensitive by choice. It is a default operating feature of the brain. The system is designed to prioritize potential problems over neutral or positive experiences because, historically, that orientation improved survival outcomes. In modern social environments, however, this same system can make harmless moments feel disproportionately significant. Understanding negative bias helps reframe how small social moments are experienced. What feels like a meaningful mistake or an important signal is often just a minor detail that the brain has amplified beyond its actual significance. The interaction itself is usually far simpler than the memory that follows it. Self-focus distorts the picture. During social interactions, people are not only processing what others are saying, they are also monitoring themselves, how they sound, how they look, whether they are saying the right thing, and how they are being perceived, all run in the background of attention. This internal monitoring is normal, but when it becomes too dominant, it can distort how an interaction is experienced and later remembered. This is the essence of self-focus. The mind becomes so centered on the self that it loses an accurate sense of the overall situation. In most conversations, each person is primarily focused on their own thoughts, intentions, and reactions. However, when someone becomes highly self-aware, they begin to assume that others are equally focused on them. This creates a mismatch between perception and reality. The individual feels as though every word, pause, or facial expression is being carefully evaluated by others, even though, in most cases, the other person is simply thinking about what to say next or processing the conversation in a general way. This phenomenon is often described as the spotlight effect, the tendency to overestimate how much attention others are paying to our behavior. When someone is caught in this effect, small actions feel amplified. A slight hesitation while speaking might feel obvious and memorable, as if it stands out in the interaction. In reality, the other person is unlikely to notice or remember it, because their attention is divided and not centered on detailed evaluation. Self-focus also changes how sensory information is interpreted in real time. Instead of fully engaging with the conversation, attention splits between participating and self-monitoring. This division reduces the amount of cognitive resources available for natural communication. As a result, speech may feel less fluid, responses may take longer to form, and interactions may feel more effortful. These internal sensations can then be misinterpreted as external signs that something is going wrong socially, even when nothing has changed in the other person's behavior. After the interaction ends, self-focus continues to influence memory. The brain tends to reconstruct events from the perspective that was most active during the experience. If a person was highly self-aware during a conversation, they are more likely to remember how they felt rather than what actually happened in detail. This means the memory of the interaction becomes centered on internal sensations, nervousness, uncertainty, or awkwardness rather than the broader context of what was said and how it was received. This inward shift can create a distorted replay of the interaction. Instead of remembering a balanced exchange between two people, the mind reconstructs a version where the self is the central figure being evaluated. In this reconstruction, neutral moments can feel charged with meaning, and ordinary responses from others can be interpreted as judgments or evaluations. The conversation becomes less about mutual exchange and more about self-assessment. Another consequence of self-focus is the illusion of transparency, the belief that internal states are more visible to others than they actually are. If someone feels nervous or uncertain, they may assume that those feelings are obvious to everyone else in the room. This belief increases self-monitoring even further, because the individual begins trying to manage not only their behavior, but also the perceived visibility of their internal experience. In reality, most people are far less perceptive to internal states than we assume. The more attention is directed inward, the less accurately the external situation is perceived. Subtle cues from others' tone shifts, engagement level, or emotional nuance can be missed or misread, because attention is tied up in self-evaluation. This can lead to a feedback loop. Increased self-focus reduces clarity about the interaction, which then increases uncertainty, which in turn reinforces even more self-focus. Breaking this cycle is less about eliminating self-awareness and more about balancing it. Some level of self-monitoring is necessary for social functioning, but when it dominates attention, it creates a distorted version of reality. Most social interactions are not as evaluative or judgment-heavy as they feel in the moment. They are usually simpler, less scrutinizing, and more forgiving than the internal experience suggests. Self-focus distorts the picture by turning a shared interaction into a private evaluation. The mind shifts from participating in the moment to analyzing itself within the moment, and in doing so, it creates a version of reality that feels more intense and consequential than it actually is. Overanalysis becomes a habit loop. Overanalysis in social situations rarely begins as a deliberate choice. It often starts as a one-time attempt to make sense of an uncomfortable or confusing interaction. A conversation feels slightly off, a message seems unclear, or a moment feels awkward, and the mind naturally tries to review what happened. This initial reflection can seem harmless, even useful, but over time, what begins as occasional reflection can develop into a repetitive mental habit that activates automatically after nearly any social exchange. At the core of this process is how the brain learns through repetition. Neural pathways strengthen when they are used frequently, even if the pattern itself is not helpful. When someone repeatedly replays conversations in their mind, analyzing tone, wording, and possible meanings, the brain begins to treat this as the expected response to social interaction. In other words, the mind learns. Social event gives mental review. As this pattern is reinforced, it becomes more automatic and harder to interrupt. The habit loop typically has 3 stages. First is the trigger. A social interaction ends. This could be something as small as a brief conversation, a text exchange, or even a casual comment. Second is the routine. The mind begins replaying the interaction, searching for meaning, mistakes, or hidden signals. Third is the reward, which is more subtle. The reward is not necessarily relief or clarity, but a temporary sense of control. By analyzing the situation, the brain feels as though it is actively preventing future mistakes or solving a problem, even if no real conclusion is reached. The act of thinking itself provides a feeling of engagement. Over time, this loop strengthens because it is self-reinforcing. The more an interaction is analyzed, the more significant it feels in memory. When something feels significant, the brain assumes it deserves even more attention. This leads to deeper and more frequent analysis, which further increases the perceived importance of similar future interactions. Gradually, the threshold for triggering overanalysis becomes lower, meaning even neutral or positive interactions can activate the same pattern. Another factor that strengthens the habit loop is uncertainty. When there is no clear answer about how an interaction went, the mind is more likely to engage in repeated review. Instead of accepting ambiguity, the brain treats it as unfinished business. This creates a sense of mental incompleteness that encourages continued thinking. Each replay feels like an attempt to resolve that incompleteness. But because social situations rarely have a single correct interpretation, the loop often continues without resolution. Memory also plays a role in maintaining the habit. Each time an interaction is replayed, the memory of it is slightly reshaped. Certain details become more prominent, especially those that feel uncertain or uncomfortable, while neutral details fade into the background. This selective reinforcement can make the interaction seem more complex or problematic than it originally was. As a result, future reflections are based on a distorted version of the event, which further justifies continued analysis. Importantly, the habit loop is not driven by a desire to overthink, but by a desire to prevent uncertainty and social discomfort. The mind is attempting to improve future outcomes by learning from past experiences. In principle, this is adaptive. Learning from experience is essential for growth. The problem arises when the system becomes overgeneralized and begins applying deep analysis to situations that do not require it. At that point, the learning process shifts from helpful reflection to repetitive rumination. As the loop becomes more established, it can begin to feel automatic. After any interaction, the mind may immediately shift into analysis mode without conscious prompting. This can create the impression that social experiences are inherently complicated or require detailed review, even when they are routine or unremarkable. Over time, this expectation itself reinforces the habit, because the brain begins to associate social activity with mental effort and post-event processing. Breaking this pattern is difficult not because the thoughts are complex, but because the habit is deeply learned. The brain is not distinguishing between useful reflection and unnecessary repetition. It is simply following a reinforced pathway. Understanding this helps clarify why overanalysis feels so persistent. It is not a sign that each interaction is important enough to analyze. It is a sign that the brain has learned to analyze automatically after social input. Overanalysis becomes a habit loop when reflection stops being a tool and starts becoming a reflex. What was once an attempt to understand social experiences turns into a default response, regardless of whether understanding is actually needed. Control seeking through thinking. Overthinking social interactions often feels like an attempt to understand what happened, but underneath that surface-level explanation is something more fundamental, a desire for control. When a conversation feels uncertain, ambiguous, or slightly off, the mind does not only want to interpret it, it wants to prevent it from happening again, or at least prevent similar discomfort in the future. Thinking becomes a tool for regaining a sense of predictability in situations that are inherently unpredictable. At a basic level, humans are motivated to reduce uncertainty. Predictable environments feel safer and easier to navigate, while unpredictable ones create tension. Social interactions, however, are not fully controllable systems. People respond differently depending on mood, context, attention, and countless other variables. Because of this, there is always an element of unpredictability in how a conversation will go or how it will be received. The mind does not always accept this limitation easily. Instead, it tries to regain control by analyzing what can be learned from each interaction. This is where thinking becomes a form of control-seeking behavior. After a social exchange, the mind may replay sentences, tone, timing, and reactions, searching for patterns. The underlying assumption is that if the correct cause and effect relationship can be identified, future outcomes can be controlled or improved. For example, if a conversation felt awkward, the mind may try to isolate a specific word, pause, or expression as the cause. The belief is that identifying the mistake will allow it to be avoided next time, restoring a sense of control over social outcomes. However, social reality rarely operates in such a linear way. Interactions are shaped by multiple, overlapping factors that cannot be fully isolated or controlled. Even small changes in tone or wording do not guarantee consistent results across different contexts or people. Because of this, the mind's search for a single controllable cause often leads to incomplete or misleading conclusions. Despite this, the process continues because the act of searching itself provides psychological comfort. The comfort comes not from accuracy, but from engagement. When the mind is actively analyzing a situation, it creates the feeling that something is being done about it. Passive uncertainty feels uncomfortable, but active thinking creates the illusion of progress. Even if no clear answer is found, the brain experiences the analysis as a form of problem solving. This can temporarily reduce the discomfort of not knowing, even though the underlying uncertainty remains unresolved. Another important aspect of control seeking through thinking is the desire to prevent future mistakes. The mind often treats past social discomfort as something that should be corrected. By understanding it deeply, this leads to repeated mental simulations of the same interaction, as if replaying it enough times will reveal the correct version of how it should have gone. The goal is not only to understand the past, but to rewrite future behavior in a way that guarantees better outcomes. This creates a subtle tension. The more important control feels, the more the mind analyzes, and the more the mind analyzes, the more significant the interaction feels. A simple conversation can start to feel like a key learning moment, not because it was objectively important, but because it has been mentally elevated through repeated review. In this way, thinking amplifies the perceived importance of the very events it is trying to control. There is also a deeper emotional layer to this process. Social uncertainty can sometimes feel like a loss of stability or predictability in how one is perceived by others. If someone is unsure how they came across in a conversation, it can feel like their social position is unclear. Thinking becomes a way to restore that clarity, to reestablish a stable narrative about what happened and how it should be interpreted. Even if the narrative is not fully accurate, it feels better than unresolved ambiguity. The difficulty is that control in social life is inherently limited. No amount of analysis can fully predict or manage how others will think, feel, or respond. The attempt to gain total control through thinking can therefore become exhausting, because it is aimed at something that cannot be fully achieved. Yet the habit persists because partial relief is still experienced each time the mind engages in analysis, reinforcing the cycle. Understanding this pattern clarifies why overthinking can feel so persistent even when it is recognized as unhelpful. It is not simply excessive analysis, it is an attempt to turn uncertainty into something manageable. Thinking becomes a substitute for control in situations where control is only partially available. Overanalyzing interactions is not a single problem with a single cause. It is the combined result of several deeply ingrained mental systems working exactly as they were designed to work, just in an environment that no longer matches their original purpose. The brain scans for social risk to to protect belonging, treats uncertainty as something that must be resolved, amplifies negative details to avoid potential mistakes, and focuses inward in a way that distorts perception. Over time, repeated use of these processes turns reflection into a habit, and the search for understanding quietly shifts into a search for control. Seen in isolation, each interaction feels important enough to dissect. A pause, a tone, a message, or a glance can seem loaded with meaning. But when viewed more clearly, most of these moments are not signals of deeper truth. They are ordinary fragments of human communication being processed through a system that is overly sensitive to ambiguity and threat. The mind is not responding to the actual weight of the situation, but to the feeling of uncertainty it creates. The difficulty is that thinking feels productive, even when it is not resolving anything. Replaying conversations creates the impression of insight, as if clarity is just one more analysis away. But social life does not operate like a problem with a single correct solution. It is fluid, context-dependent, and shaped by many factors that cannot be fully controlled or decoded. Because of this, the mind's effort to extract certainty from every interaction often leads to more interpretation rather than real understanding. Recognizing these patterns changes the role of overthinking. Instead of treating it as evidence that something went wrong, it becomes easier to see it as a predictable response to uncertainty, habit, and the brain's preference for control. The goal is not to eliminate reflection entirely, but to notice when reflection has stopped being useful and started becoming repetitive. Most interactions do not need to be solved. They are experienced, not decoded, and when the mind stops treating every moment as a problem to resolve, it becomes possible to let conversations remain what they usually are: brief, imperfect, and far less significant than they feel in replay.